Welcome to West Ohio Conversations, a podcast from the West Ohio Conference of the United Methodist Church. Today we join a conversation between Bishop Gregory Von Palmer, Reverend Barb Scholas, Reverend Brent Watson, and conference communicator Kay Panevec as they discuss how pastoral appointments are really made.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Today we're talking about the appointment-making process in the West Ohio Annual Conference. The first question I have for you is, at one point in time, you were on the other side of the table. You were people receiving appointments, not necessarily making those appointments. So as a pastor yourself, were there rumors or thoughts that you had about how the bishop and the cabinet made those appointments?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's always, in a large system, it's my contention that there is always mythology or urban legends, to use a more contemporary term. And appointment making would be no different. It's a significant part of a large system called an annual conference, and West Ohio Conference would be a large annual conference. So I assume that there's significant mythology or urban legends about that. I experienced that both as a recipient of an appointment, as a pastor to local churches or to the cabinet, and as a person now who makes appointments. And by the way, the bishop also receives an appointment or an assignment from the jurisdictional conference. I am an elder under appointment.
I know for myself, I did not understand the appointive process, really what happened around that cabinet table until I had the opportunity to sit around the cabinet table. And I remember my very first day observing the cabinet after I'd been appointed as a new DS. And at the end of that day, Bishop O looked at me and he said, "Barb, what do you think about this?" And my thought was, every itinerant pastor should have to sit around this table at least one day. It's not the proverbial pull the name out of the hat or the dartboard that we all envision. It's a very thoughtful process with a lot of moving parts and covered by prayer. It's a very thoughtful process.
Brent, what about you?
Yeah, as a local church pastor, I think it was always my goal to stay away from DSs. So in my mind, I thought as long as they didn't think about me or know my name, I would probably be safe. That probably wasn't a fair assessment, just because I think...
It's an urban legend.
It's an urban legend. But, I think it was just in my mind one way of trying to control my future, when in fact I needed to trust that God was in the midst of controlling my future.
I mean, what is the process? Let's just start at the very beginning.
Let me start with context, and then we can all weigh in with process, and we can all weigh in on context. Let me say, I assume that the mission of the church has something to say about everything the church does. So the mission of the United Methodist Church, as we repeat all the time, is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. We may have tweaks and nuances to that, and that's a wonderful thing. Something that takes as much energy and human as well as financial resources ought to be aligning with that mission. So I want to say that the cabinet with which I sit, the 8 district superintendents and any other people that we involve in conversation and consultation, we make appointments in West Ohio with the intent that those appointments, pastors sent to local congregations, clergy and lay people partnering together through the appointment process and the practice of ministry, are focused on the mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Everything else, including process, ought to flow out of that. So we try to discern some of that through profiles. Clergy and congregations do profiles, etc. And I'll toss the baton to others to pick up.
Yeah, I think one of the critical factors is what happens before we ever get to the cabinet room and the conversation is for a district superintendent to know the pastors of that district, as well as for those pastors to take the initiative to be known and to make sure they have expressed their gifts and their talents, who they are, and where they would best serve. So I think some of that conversation has to happen prior so that cabinet meeting is influenced by the relationships that we've shared together.
I also think the cabinet works very diligently to hold in tandem some of the reports that we utilize, as well as the narratives of what are going on in the lives of those churches. So it's not an either or. We're not just looking at statistics. We're not just listening to the story, but we're combining the two. And I think Brent is right as well. One of the things that we're testing this appointive season is that those elders who have requested in writing a move, we are having a conversation with them, inviting them to meet with a team of 3 district superintendents that are not the one that is supervising them currently, who we believe and assume has a relationship already with that clergy person, but just to expand the conversation so that as we prayerfully deliberate around that table, all of us in some capacity have had a little more opportunity to have conversation with those clergy who are requesting a move. It's one of the things we're testing. It's one of the things that we're excited about, and it's just one more avenue to expand how we bring names to the table, the cabinet conversation, and deliberate around what would be the best missional fit for the clergy and for the congregation.
What do you think would be the biggest surprise for people to know about what happens in the cabinet room or about the process?
I don't know if this is the biggest one, but I think people, as has been implied already, they would have an aha moment as to how labor-intensive appointment making is. And that doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean it's easy. It's labor-intensive. And that includes the labor of gathering knowledge and information about people, context, settings, dreams, and hopes for where we think there ought to be churches. It's the labor intensity of prayer, and prayer is a lift, and it should be a lift. We should engage it as holy work. And it is sometimes the labor intensiveness of competing goods, so that there are often, for a particular appointment, more than one person who could do the job, but there's only one of that particular appointment, so that the work of discerning is sometimes not the easy work of here's the obvious choice, as opposed to here's the person that this is not the place for them at this time. It's that we have wonderful and gifted clergy whose names may have been brought to the table as nominations to a place, multiples of which could do the job. So that would be among the ahas that I think we've all experienced over time. Finally, I'd say on labor intensity, just the challenge of moving in this age. Itineration itself is a challenge. It's a challenge for congregations, it's a challenge for pastors and clergy, and it's a challenge for the system in multiple ways. Challenge doesn't assume negativity, but it does mean a measure of work that doesn't have the ease with which some people may perceive it.
I think I would hop on that notion and say there are a couple things that I think would be surprises. One is that I think sometimes we fall easily into the business model where we're just moving people around, just trying to stick people in certain places. And I think people would be surprised that there's a whole spiritual connotation to all of this, that we strive to be spiritual leaders who are attuned to God's Spirit and what person would work best in another place. And I think secondly is also how personal it is taking into account tethers and factors in people's lives that are much more complicated than maybe many of us even think about or realize. And so it's trying to think about that person and the gifts that they bring and the particular places they are in the seasons of their life and how best to utilize them in a church.
Without giving out any specific person, talk a little bit about these tethers. What does that mean?
Well, we have obviously among our pastoral, let me say, households, we are much more in the 21st century people that our families are dependent upon multiple incomes. So that economics is a huge tether, not just in terms of the need for money to sustain oneself, i.e. Spouses both who work, but also meaning and fulfillment that comes from work. So sometimes spousal income becomes a tether, meaning a person says, I would prefer to stay in this geography for this season. Where children are in school sometimes is a tether. Sometimes people feel tethered by a sense of engagement that they've had often through the church with a particular community. So their influence in that community is pretty far-reaching and significant. And as we go forward, we have found over, I would say, certainly the last decade, not that it was never true before, but as families become more complex, for a variety of reasons, somebody is widowed, divorced, etc. People requesting to have an appointment in geography A so they can be more helpful with their grandchildren. In a similar way, people are asking sometimes to get into certain geographies because of aging parents. So those are tethers. They're not all of the same. They don't all have the same pull on the individual or the household, but they are all there. And I've just named 3 to 5.
The other part of that is, though, our district superintendents have asked our itinerant clergy if they are tethered to every year note that in writing. And part of the reason for that being because of tethers, because of limited itinerancy, it in some ways confines the appointive process. And so because of that, some clergy may, if they must stay in a certain area and there's not an appointment, they may not move. Or they may have to look at taking less than full time. And so part of it is, I think, an ongoing conversation between the clergy person and the district superintendent to say, here are the limitations, and perhaps they're just for a season. Perhaps they're just for a year or two until a child is out of school or someone's retiring or whatever. But to have those honest conversations so that when that district superintendent comes to the time of making appointments with the cabinet, they can give the most up-to-date and clarifying information possible.
My understanding is that there are some new concepts that you're bringing into this appointment season. I believe one of those things is called Clear Opens. Could you explain that a little bit to us?
Yes, Clear Open churches are churches. This is actually, let me just back up a little bit and say this is something that's been used in several other conferences, most notably Minnesota, Northern Illinois, Michigan. And so it's something that we are testing this year as a cabinet, and it's a list of churches that have already announced, most often through retirement, that their clergy person is leaving. And so what we are doing is we are posting those churches, and we are inviting interested. We're only working with elders and associate members right now as we test, but if they see a church of interest and would like to know further, they need to email the district superintendent of the open church district and share what they think their gifts and graces are, and they need to copy their current district superintendent if that's a different district superintendent as well. And really what this does for us is it just brings another sort of avenue of interested names into the appointment process. You know, cabinet members will bring their own list of names. The cabinet together will generate and discern congregation needs and missional needs, and the expressing of an interest by these clergy in these Clear Open churches brings their name into the conversation as well. It's honored, it's heard, it's also kept confidential in the appointment process. It does not guarantee, if you put your name in there, that you're going to be appointed to that church. But what it does say is, you know, I would have an interest in being considered for this. And so that's a real new concept for West Ohio.
And the second concept is one that Barb mentioned earlier, kind of the getting to know you conversation, because obviously, you know, West Ohio is a large conference as far as geographically, and so sometimes a DS may not know a particular person. So this gives us some extra eyes and ears to get to know folks again on a more personal level as we think about appointment season coming up.
Is there anything else that you would like to include in this podcast in regard to the appointment-making process?
One is, while we are entering into an intensive period of appointment making during the winter, spring, because it is the duty of the bishop to announce all appointments at the annual conference, we have learned increasingly through a number of cycles of doing this work that the term appointment season might itself be an urban legend, because we're doing more and more appointments all the time. And appointments can be made all the time. That's always been in the discipline, always been possible. There's no doubt that a lot more of it gets done on the cycle of the annual conference session. But increasingly we find, because of just the complexity of life and things that nobody's in control of, that we're making more and more appointments, let me use the word off cycle from the annual conference session. And the final thing that I would wish to say is we are deeply and prayerfully committed to the mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And that's the plumb line against which we want to make all appointments. Are there things that aren't ideal, circumstances, settings, situations, etc.? Of course there are. But we, by aspiration, intention, and hope, we have no plan to demur from the mission of using the appointment-making process in the service of the mission of the United Methodist Church here in West Ohio.
And my last question for you today is, there might be people listening to this podcast who wonder, what could they do to be supportive of our cabinet and our bishop, not only during these appointment times, but throughout the year? Is there something that we could do for all of you?
There are two things I would mention. One is prayer, obviously, and again, sometimes we forget to pray for those who are in leadership positions, and I think it's critical, especially as we try to be sensitive to the work of the Holy Spirit, that we're being prayed for. And secondly, I think just encouraging. Sometimes as a district superintendent, I hear the complaints or when things are not going well at a local church. And sometimes just a simple word of encouragement goes a long way to realizing we're in a wonderful season of watching churches and pastors being united for the mission of Jesus Christ. And that's a hopeful thing to me, and that's a thing that stirs me, it's why I do what I do. But I think just some encouragement along the way helps us to stay focused and to move forward.
I would echo that. I would say also, this too could be you sitting here, and that's the interesting thing about being part of cabinet experience, because we are peers, we are colleagues, and for this season in our life, we are serving in this appointed role. And so to remember that we are your friends, your colleagues, your clergy cohorts out there. So that's one thing. The second is to remember that appointment making is an art, not a science. And finally, for me, just the prayers, that there be a listening for the nudging, urging of the Holy Spirit as we go through this appointed season.
Bishop, Brent, Barb, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this morning. We appreciate the gifts you bring to our conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to West Ohio Conversations. If you would like to suggest a topic or idea for a future podcast, please email us at mychurchstory@wocumc.org. For more information about everything happening at the West Ohio Conference, please follow us on Facebook or Twitter, or visit our website, westohioumc.org.